I struggled for 10 minutes to get on this morning.
Did you? Oh, thank you. That makes me feel a lot better, Tim.
So hopefully we'll get some more people trickling in as time goes on.
I think so, particularly the Aussies. It's awfully early their time.
Yes, yes. And did Skip promise you a certain time constraint or anything?
No, we talked about it a little bit. If you've got some suggestions, I'm happy to move with those.
Well, usually we go about 2 hours.
Yeah.
And after that point, I want to make sure that people feel comfortable in dropping out if they have other things to do,
Sure.
and not make us feel like we're all of a sudden getting boring. But also, my experience with these kinds of encounters, especially with a person with your expertise, is people will hang on as long as you want to go.
Oh,
so
okay.
You might just have to say, okay, that's enough for me.
Well, you know, one of the things that I think is possible if my energy runs out, because I am somewhat circumscribed, is that people might well want to continue to talk about some of these issues, regardless of whether I'm here. I'm not sure whether I've got the following or whether the Red Book has the following. I think it's more likely that it's the Red Book. But anyway, you know, if I say, all right, I've got to check out, go ahead, then I'll leave it with both of you.
So thank you very much for your patience. We are now online, and we are online with 77 people on Zoom, and so far another 6 on YouTube, but that will go up steadily through the hour and a half. Now, what I have promised Dr. Mellick is that she will have some time at the beginning to show us a PowerPoint that she showed to the Jung family, or she can correct me if that's wrong. And then after that PowerPoint, she'll give us about 1 hour for Q&A. And then I will give her, but after that PowerPoint, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We can continue to chat, but we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then the Q&A will take place 1 hour. And then I promise to give Dr. Mellick a graceful exit. And so I hope to do that. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Tim, since Tim is our artist and I'm not the artist here. And so Tim, if you would continue to host Dr. Mellick, and go ahead.
Sure, you betcha. I'm Tim Holmes. I'm a sculptor mostly. You can see a little bit of work kind of in the background. I do a lot of figurative work, and I've also done a lot of painting and drawing. And I've been fascinated with Jung for at least 30 years and absolutely captivated by the Red Book. So I was really delighted to run into Dr. Mellick and her wonderful book, the Red Book Hours, which is what we're going to be addressing today. I tend to be biased toward the artistic rather than the, well, not rather than the psychological approach, but I think for many people here, the interest is going to be either on the end of the psychology or on the end of the kind of the artistic process. And fortunately, we're able to cover that whole area. So I think this is going to be just an absolutely fascinating exploration. What I would like to do is to encourage anybody who has questions to either put them in the chat, or if you're watching on YouTube, put them in the chat on YouTube, and maybe Skip, you can monitor that. I will monitor the questions in the Zoom chat. And of course, if anybody wants to ask questions, just live on the mic, that's fine too, but that's a little bit more chaotic. It'll be helpful if you raise your hand or give an indication maybe in the chat that you have a question you want to ask. But
right. And
let's
raise hand is a function up in the participants channel portion of your screen. So you can punch that and it'll give a little raised hand on your video. So go ahead, Tim, I'm sorry.
But I want to encourage all the questions, but let's give Dr. Mellick a chance to go through her presentation and just be thinking about the questions as we go, and then we'll get to the Q&A afterwards. So I'm absolutely honored to be able to have you with us today. Your book is really fascinating. As I say, I've been really into Jung for many, many years, and I get the sense reading your book that it is really geared toward people who are kind of obsessed with his life and his work. And I've never been able to experience this incredible feeling of being close to the way he worked, seeing his office and talking about his standing desk and being able to scrutinize the materials. For me, it's just an absolute delight. So I'm very grateful for your book, and I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. So I have no idea. I can see you, Tim, in the full screen. Is there something I need to do to make me full screen, or do you see me full screen now?
Well, I think we all have options.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I have made you co-host now, Jill, so you can, if you share your screen, it will be full screen for everyone, but
oh, okay.
you can keep yours
panelists.
onto gallery view if you want, so that you can see your audience. But once you share your screen, then it should come up on full for all of us.
Okay, now when I go to share the screen, Skip, it says who can share, only host or all panelists? Which do I click?
So, I'm sorry, what? Say again your question.
Only you, probably.
So only host?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And then there's the little button in the bottom. You see that where you can share your material.
You got me?
Yep, we have you full screen.
Okay. And do you have my desktop full screen or me full screen?
We have you full screen at the moment.
Good. That's good. Okay. Well, I'm going to get off because I think.
Okay. There's one other thing that I need to do. There's one attendee here who's on telephone, whose number starts with 1707. And unfortunately, I hit the wrong button for you. And as a result of that fact, I'm not going to be able to get you into the panel. Whoever that is, 1707, is going to end up in the attendees section permanently. That was my mistake, but you should be able to raise your hand and ask a question. You just won't be seen on the screen. I apologize for that mistake. That was one of those techie things. So we do see your screen now, Jill. Thank you.
All right. So, and you're seeing my desktop now, Skip, right?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So, I'm going to start with something rather irreverent. When I first went to Switzerland about all of this, I first saw the archivist at the Jung Institute in Küsnacht, and he took me up to the attic where there are thousands of Jung's and Alessand's paintings residing. And you're not allowed, of course, to take anything there, but this sign on the way up and down really tickled me. However, I never thought in my wildest dreams that it would be relevant to me. It was. I tripped headlong into the world of the Red Book. A couple of weeks ago, Dr. Ann Ulanoff warned us that dipping into it is a sticky process, and I'm here to say it is. After 3 years of researching Jung's mediums and getting nowhere, I was looking forward to at least concluding my time by being in Switzerland and doing something pleasant Andreas Jung had offered to show me Jung's workspaces in Küsnacht, and U.S.C offered to take me to Bollingen. I never imagined, nor would I have agreed to a 9-year project, but I fell in love, and 460 pages later, I'm still in love. Thank you, Dr. Conover, for inviting me to join you all. It really is fascinating to be with you in your different time zones. And thank you for, sorry, I got to get this back there. And thank you too for inviting me to share some of what led to the Red Book Hours. Ever since I was a teenager in Brisbane, Australia, I've loved exploring creative processes. And even after 11 years of exploring Jung's creative process and the mediums he used, I still find it fascinating, and I look forward to exploring a little of this together with you. And I do want to say first that my work was made possible by many. This was not a solo adventure. Dr. Jean Schutz introduced me to Jung's work in the first place. Decades later, she was a tireless personal and professional supporter of my wild goose chase and my writing. Ulrich Hörny, the previous director of the Works Foundation, Thomas Fischer, current director of the Works Foundation, Andreas Jung, one of Jung's grandsons and resident of the house that Jung built in Küsnacht, Dr. Joost Hörny, another of Jung's grandsons and chief steward of Jung's retreat at Bollingen, Dr. Helen Tate, whose contribution helped make the scientific analysis financially possible, and Eileen and John Donahoe, who defrayed the high costs involved in publishing such an image-rich book. Without their help and myriad others, my work really wouldn't exist. What Jung called Atmavictu, the breath of life, the creative impulse, informed him and moved him throughout his life. He further comments, a creative person has little power over his own life. He's not free. He is captive and driven by his daimon. As memories, dreams, and reflections and the art of C.G. Jung confirm, he needed to find art-based ways of expressing his inner world in childhood, and this continued into his last years. So the Red Book was a particular period in a lifelong practice. So we need to see the Red Book in context. It's one of many, many creative works. I realized that by the time Jung was in his teens, he'd already found the main mediums he would use for his creative work for the rest of his life. That really fascinated me. He'd really explored them before he was 10. My own journey began in Australia, in Sydney in 1975. I went to a small exhibit of replicas from the Red Book, and I can still remember their power. And then in 2009, Dr. Schutz and I went to the Rubin Museum in New York, which you see here, to see the original Red Book, which is right in the middle. It was open at a spread showing a mandala, of which this is a small part. And I was struck by how the colors seemed to glow. When I'm not seeing patients or writing, I make art. So I wanted to know how he got his effects. What medium did he use? So I asked and asked and asked, and no one knew. I also realized that Jung must have spent untold hours on each of these illuminations and the calligraphy. I mean, just look at this detail. It's less than 2 square centimeters. Jung drew more than 400 just in this little 2 centimeter section, more than 400 separate black lines, and more than 120 cells of color. Just here. So I wondered why
and each of those cells of color look like they have hundreds of little dots in them.
they're actually not dots. They are the pigment, which is suspended in, I'll get to that, Skip, but
Okay.
it is a gritty, it's grittier than watercolor. It's grittier than other paints. And I'll get to that because that particularly interested me. But yes, what you're seeing is there. Some of it is what's called craquelure, but I'll also get to that too. Anyway, I wondered why Jung used such a labor-intensive method. Any other technique would have been easier and could eloquently render his visions and dreams. Now, you might wonder why I wanted to know what mediums and techniques Jung used. Did his choice of mediums and techniques make a difference to him when he spent thousands of hours, 60 years, immersed in this creative experience? Well, yes, it did make a difference to his experience of his creative process. Different mediums and different techniques affect each artist's experience of a different process. For example, I painted this landscape with transparent watercolor. My experience was of being in an intimate, unpredictable relationship with a strong-willed, elegant other. I also knew each movement I made was irreversible, permanent. The outcome was both anticipated and unknown. I later painted the same landscape in gouache, another water-based technique, and I had quite a different experience. I was more in charge. I experienced less of the joys, but I also experienced less of the perils of being in an unpredictable relationship with my technique. But I also had the freedom and reassurance of knowing I could correct my errors. Gouache is an opaque technique, so I could paint over anything I didn't like. I just have a technical question here. Am I looking now, do you all see me looking at you? Because I'm showing me over on the right and I keep turning my neck over to the right, which doesn't work very well for me. But when I'm speaking right now, do you see me looking directly at you?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just look at the camera.
Good.
What happens is the Zoom puts your picture over on the right, but
okay, that helps a lot. I don't have a very cooperative neck. So it's really not surprising that Jung chose water-based mediums and stone so often for his creative work. Water played a crucial role in his life. Joost took me to view Jung's childhood home in this past that you can see on the opposite side of the magnificent Rhine Falls. Living here was not just a visual experience for Jung, it was an auditory one. He says, and I quote, "The muted roar of the Rhine Falls was always audible." So Jung knew early on as well that he must live beside the water for the rest of his life. So as a young married man, when his wife Emma's father died suddenly, Jung and Emma were able to build what was literally the house of his dreams. They chose Küsnacht, right on the Zurich Sea. Both here and in the Küsnacht house, which he took an active interest and role in designing, and later in the tower he built in Bollingen, he lived very close indeed to the water. Well, I didn't know I was walking down a path toward a 9-year affair when I walked down this entry to Jung's house at 228 Seestrasse to meet Andreas Jung. And since then, I've often thought of Konstantin Cavapy's poem, Journey to Ithaca, where he says, "When you set out for Ithaca, pray that your journey may be a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery." Andreas had graciously told me that even though nobody knew anything about Jung's Red Book medium, if I were in Switzerland, I was welcome at least to see his library and study at 228 Seestrasse, where Andreas still lives with his wife, Rennie. The library only has one balcony, or really I should say only the library has a balcony, and it looks directly out, of course, on the water. From the library balcony, one not only sees but hears the water and the bells sounding the hour from the other side of the lake. Now here you can see the study. It's his other workplace, and it faces away from the lake, which would be surprising at first. Do you see those small windows above the peaked roof on the left? They're the study windows. Andreas showed me into the study. Jung had built bookshelves by then, well after the house had been finished. Before I had arrived, I asked Andreas about a small reference I'd come across. A patient mentioned a standing desk on which Jung kept the Red Book open during analytic hours. Andreas is a historical conservation architect, so he and I looked here for where such a desk might have stood. And I, of course, had wondered earlier what had happened to this standing desk. After I mentioned it to Andreas prior to visiting, Andreas recalled seeing such an object, and it was in the garden shed. Apparently, Jung relegated it to the garden shed when he no longer wanted it for the Red Book. The gardener, Herr Müller, was a practical man, so he cut off the front of the desk so that the door would open. Andreas brought out a facsimile of the Red Book, and it was just the right size for the Red Book. He also noted that it was unusually high. Jung was a very tall man, and he would have needed this extra height on this standing desk so that he could work at it. This desk was, as you might have noticed, the same color as the study. Analysis later showed that it was built and painted at a different time from when this original study was built. So at least my question to Andreas helped him redeem Jung's standing desk from the humble place in the gardening shed. Having a role in finding this was quite enough to satisfy me. I'd expected nothing, and we'd found Jung's actual desk. Andreas had also put me in touch with his cousin, another of Jung's grandsons, Dr. Joost Herney. Joost is one of the main stewards of Jung's tower, and Andreas said that some of Jung's wall painting pigments were still at the tower, and that Joost knew more about them than he. So Joost and I arranged to meet. Being a guest, I thought I'd better show my respect in what I wore. Joost arrived in his black Jeep, and I hopped in. He shook my hand, and then as we pulled out of the hotel, he said with dry humor, "We are going to the country, you know." I was extremely relieved, and I took off all of my outer layers and trappings. And together we drove this lakeside road you see here, the 30 minutes it takes to get to Bollingen. We arrived here. It's quite visible from the lake, but it's not visible at all from the road. This is a family photograph of the tower. I was pleased to visit the tower again. I'd been there years earlier with a group, and this time it would be a quiet experience with Joost as host. I also looked forward to at least seeing some of the painting materials Jung had used for something. Even though they weren't used in the Red Book, I knew that just seeing them would let me feel closer to his work as an artist, which was what Tim was talking about. I thought that this would be a fitting coda to my inquiries. Joost unlocked the great door and took me across the main courtyard, past the loggia, to the edge of the Obersee, the upper part of the lake. Jung built the tower right on the water. The afternoon evolved in Bollingen time, which is a kind of timeless time. Joost alternated showing me bas-reliefs and freestanding sculpture, and then taking time to chop wood. He explained that there are always a lot of trees needing cutting, but the lake itself brings a lot of wood in too, so there's always work to be done. And while he worked, I sat quietly beside the lake. It was a good rhythm. I could absorb what Joost had just shown me before looking at something new. I could watch and listen to the movement of the water, the movement of the rushes, and see the pre-alps in the distance. Jung spent hours looking at the lake. According to Barbara Hannah, Jung once asked her how a certain talk had gone that he'd given. And Hannah, being British and very forthright, said that some parts weren't as clear as they might have been. Jung thought about this and then said, clearly, I did not spend enough time sitting and looking at the lake before I wrote it. Late in the afternoon, Joost fetched 2 old boxes containing bags and cans of pigments and pigment charts. This bag Joost is holding is the first he showed me. The sunlight was shining strongly on each pigment Joost showed me. Here, he's holding the remains of a rich mustard-colored pigment that Jung had left in a marzipan wrapping. And this pigment, whose maker was unidentified, was wrapped in a kind of rice paper. Then Joost showed me 2 color charts. I still remember the sound of the lake close by and the strength of the afternoon light. I looked and my intuition went wild. The colors on this chart and the next one looked to me just like the palette of colors Jung used in the Red Book. Joost is a scientist like his grandfather, so I doubted that my intuitive leap would carry much weight with him. However, I was so startled that I did mention it. I did stop short of jumping to conclusions. After all, Joost and I both realized that even if the colors Jung used for wall paintings looked like those in the Red Book, Jung might have just liked these colors, this color palette. The resemblance said nothing definitive about whether Jung had used these pigments in the Red Book. But I couldn't let go of the sense that I was looking right at the Red Book. I tried not to get ahead of myself, I think fairly unsuccessfully. However, Joost is a natural researcher, an historian at Bollingen, so he was as intrigued as I. By the way, you see that top right color? It's called Uragelb. It's made from uranium. And 100 years later, it still emits faint radiation. By the way, just to back up to something that Skip said at the beginning, this was actually not a presentation I made to the Jungs, but a presentation I made with most of the Jungs down in Santa Barbara. And I've added some for you for today. But it was somewhat daunting, I might say, to be presenting this with the Jungs. I felt a little bit like the cuckoo in the nest. Joost showed me some of the top manufacturers that Jung used for his pigments. And he showed me a price list too. Those pigments were expensive. Keimfarben, as you see here, was one of the makers. Many buildings in Germany and Austria and Switzerland are decorated with art on the outside walls. But these paintings suffered from the weather. And Adolf Keim invented a weatherproof paint. And such was the contribution culturally that the Kaiser decorated him for this contribution. Here are the technical instructions Keim gave artists for painting on walls. They trained Christian Schmidt, as you see in the lower right, in Zurich, how to use and sell these. The other side of this trifold chart shows some of Keim's other colors. And you can see that Jung put a neat pencil mark beside each color every time he bought it. Jung also ordered pigments from another top German manufacturer, IG Farben. Many years later, IG Farben turned their attention from creation to destruction. They became infamous for making the gas for the concentration camp gas chambers. Because I was so struck by the similarity, and because Joost was both generous and also deeply interested, Joost sought permission from the Bollingen Foundation to sample most of the pigments and send them to me. He carefully sampled each of Jung's pigments from all the makers, Keim, IG Farben, and the pigments from unknown makers. And he placed each sample in a vial. Then he mailed these vials to me in groups by ordinary post. This box holds the samples he took of Keim pigments. Then this box of vials, of which these are a few, contains samples of the IG Farben pigments. The third group he sent were vials of pigments that had no identifiable maker. Joost, being a physician, called these orphan pigments. Some diseases are so rare that they attract no funding, and they're called orphan diseases. And Joost, as a physician, thought it was a rather good name for them, and it stuck. Now, of course, only paint samples from the Red Book itself could establish a scientific connection between the Bollingen pigments and what Jung used for the Red Book. The Red Book lives in a pelican box in a bank vault on the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich. These boxes are dustproof, waterproof, crush-proof, and keep temperature and humidity steady. However, trying to get samples from the Red Book was a huge challenge. We explored every option, and they all proved impossible. Dr. Murray Stein mentioned last week that the cost of insuring the Red Book is prohibitive. The insurance company charges thousands of Swiss francs for every day that the manuscript is out of the vault. Only one possibility remained. Ulrich Hörny told Joost, his brother, that he remembered seeing paint flakes in the gutters of the Red Book when it was first opened after 50 years. However, since then, the Red Book had traveled around the world on display, and those tiny flakes almost certainly would have disappeared. And to make things even more impossible, there was only literally one day for several years when anyone could look at the Red Book in the bank vault itself to see if there were still some paint flakes in the gutters. And here it's also important to credit Kairos, the felicitous act of time, in what happened. The Venice Biennale had asked the Works Foundation if they could display the Red Book that year. The foundation had said yes, so Ulrich Hörny had to go to the vault to write a condition report before the manuscript left for Venice. Joost went with his brother, Ulrich, to see if any paint flakes were left. Joost went fully prepared. If he spotted anything, he would use medical tools to harvest it. So here you are in the back vault with the Red Book. Jung chose a heavyweight vellum. So it weighs close to 10 kilos or 20 pounds. Joost is showing here where Jung cut out the first few vellum pages of the Red Book and slipped in the parchment leaves he'd already painted. As you know, Jung called these Liber Primus and the vellum Liber Secundus. Joost, being a physician, arrived well prepared. Mirabile dictu, a few microcosmic particles of something were in the gutters of the book. With a fine scalpel, Joost lifted the particles from the gutters of the Red Book. He warned me that they looked like dust and might well be dust. Needless to say, he and I both hoped that they were paint flakes, but they certainly looked like dust. And he sent these priceless articles to me in vials, noting the page number of the gutter from which he'd taken it on the outside. These vials, the only samples of the Red Book that would ever be collected, arrived in my postbox in a brown paper package sent by ordinary mail from Zurich. Swiss Post is far more trustworthy than the US. Meanwhile, I'd been looking for a conservation scientist qualified and willing to analyze these powdered pigments and these particles. I recall being on the lanai of our tiny oceanfront apartment in Kauai, that's my Bollingen, when I spoke with Dr. Jennifer Mass, the senior scientist at the Winterthur Museum Department of Art Conservation at the University of Delaware. Not only is she one of the leading conservation scientists in the world, but she's a specialist and works on paper during the period in which Jung was painting. She was off to France to assess the no longer stolen Munch's Scream, The Scream, and other very highly known and regarded paintings. But she said that on her return from this trip to Europe, she'd be delighted to do this, and that she would use X-ray fluorescence, micro-Raman spectrography, ultraviolet and electron spectroscopy, and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. If you can repeat all of that, I will send you a copy at the Red Book House. Needless to say, I did not send her the pigments or the small particles from the Red Book by ordinary mail. Well, Jennifer first analyzed the pigments from Bollingen. Then she analyzed the minute particles. They were smaller than a grain of rice that Joost had removed with his scalpel from the Red Book. First, she told us that the particles were not dust, but paint flakes. Then she compared these few paint flakes with the Bollingen pigments. Joost and I, needless to say, were holding our breath. Jennifer magnified each of these paint flakes hundreds of times. You can see one in the top left here. These microcosmic universes let Jennifer compare them with the Bollingen pigments. There was a match between many of the Bollingen pigments and the Red Book flakes. These are the pigments on this particular page here that Jennifer identified in the paint flakes. Now here is where an artist's choice of medium can tell us much. Jung could have bought paints far better suited for his work in the Red Book. He didn't. He could have bought watercolor, he could have bought gouache, he could have bought all sorts of things that would have more easily served what he was doing. But no, he chose these pigments which were designed for use on hard surfaces, walls, not for flexible surfaces like parchment and vellum. So he took a risk. He knew these pigments were designed for use on walls. What distinguishes these pigments from others prepared for painters is that they are, as you can see, intense, brilliant, almost luminescent. These were what I'd seen in the Red Book in 2009. Jennifer analyzed all the pigments Joost sent. Jung used them all for his wall painting, and he probably used these too in the Red Book. However, as Joost was only able to lift a few flakes from the Red Book, Jennifer couldn't formally find a match between these and the flakes. However, even if you have a cursory glance at these, it makes it a bit hard to believe that many of these were not also used in the Red Book. Jennifer analyzed the orphan pigments, several of which Jung used in the Red Book, including this pigment, which is called Scheele's Green. Scheele's Green has a very interesting and dangerous history. It's arsenic-based, it's highly toxic, and it was immensely popular with most early 20th century painters. Jung used Scheele's Green frequently in the Red Book. He also bought gold leaf, pure gold powder, pure silver powder, and metallic paints, including this can at the top. Joost sent the samples in the middle picture, and Jennifer found that Jung did indeed use this metallic gold paint in the Red Book. In the bottom image, you can compare the effect of gold paint and gold leaf. Jung preferred to use gold leaf in larger areas in the Red Book. So in this case, here in the bottom photograph, Jung used gold paint in the circle on the left and gold leaf in the larger area on the right. So now we know the mediums Jung was using. So let me invite you to hover invisibly over Jung's shoulder with me as he obtains the rest of his supplies for the Red Book. As you know, Jung had a series of visions, and he was a pioneer in exploring the universe of inner experience. Being a scientist and a researcher, he needed to find ways to research, document, and theorize about his inner world. He needed to create the methodologies that were suited to his purpose. Being multi-talented, he used many methods to re-experience, document, and reflect on his inner world. But the mediums and the techniques he chose clearly show that he was more interested in the processes he devised to document, re-experience, and theorize about his inner world than he was in the product, stunning as the product is. As you know, Jung used medieval manuscripts as inspiration. I took these images at the Jerusalem 1000 to 1400 exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 2016. Medieval manuscript makers used different techniques, one of which was tempera. Tempera technique mixes powdered pigments with gum arabic, water, egg, glue, honey, casein, which is a milk extract, and plant gums. Medieval manuscript makers also used watercolor and gouache techniques. Both watercolor and gouache techniques simply mix pigments, gum arabic, and water. Watercolor is transparent, but gouache, of course, is opaque. Manufacturers and artists make the color opaque by adding filler, often titanium dioxide. Opaque paint covers the surface completely. You can see the difference in the bottom line there between the thinned paint. It's still covering very heavily on the gouache side and showing the paper through transparently on the left. Jung did not use tempera. Many describe the Red Book illuminations as tempera, but they're not tempera. Jung only used watercolor and gouache. By the way, contrary to the way that we commonly use the words watercolor and gouache, these are not mediums. They are techniques. Jung used gum arabic as the only medium for both his watercolor and gouache techniques. The Latin plural, of course, the medium is media, but the word has such an association now with social media and news that I simply couldn't use it, and I opted for the anglicized plural. Gum arabic is made from the sap of the acacia tree. We call it wattle in Australia. It binds fine particles of powdered pigments together. Jung needed titanium dioxide. He wanted to use it in two ways. He added it to watercolor to make the watercolor opaque, that is, to turn it into gouache. He used titanium dioxide too as a separate opaque white paint. He ordered this bottle from the laboratory at the ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, where he had had an academic position. Joost sampled it, and Jennifer indeed found it in paint flakes from the Red Book. And here you can see how Jung used his white opaque titanium dioxide to cover other paints. So now we know all the mediums that Jung used in the Red Book. We can deduce from that all of the other supplies that he would have needed. First, he needed high quality sable brushes. Each had a different tip for a different technique. He needed calligraphy inks, black, red, green, blue, yellow, and calligraphy pen nibs to use with these inks. These nibs happen, in fact, to be made in the same period in which Jung was making the Red Book. He needed geometry instruments, including rulers, dividers, set square, compass, protractors, and of course pencils, some soft, some hard. And he needed an awl, AWL, which medieval manuscript makers also used. Jung used this awl to pierce fine holes through several leaves at once. He could then use these pinpricks on each page with which to draw pencil guidelines for the calligraphy. He needed high quality watercolor paper on which to experiment with drafts for illuminated pages. And lowly bottles, one for water to add to pigment and medium, others to clean brushes, some for mixing paints and sealing them so they stayed wet for their next use, such as this one. This bottle was one of the first that Joost and I saw that afternoon at Bollingen. It's still ready to be used almost 100 years later. So now Jung had all the materials to make the Red Book. He, like all the people in Mahali's study of highly creative individuals, was highly susceptible to environment. But only a few creative people can create from scratch the environment in which to create. Jung could do and did do this, both at his Kusnachthaus and the tower. He'd already designed his library and study beside the lake, according to his specifications. So he chose to work on the Red Book at night, there after a long day of seeing his patients and dining with his children and wife. The library French doors open onto the balcony overlooking the lake, and the library window opens onto the lake. Jung required this environment where he could be undisturbed, alone, in the silence of the library. It let him highly focus on the rendering of the calligraphy and the illuminations. He would have spread supplies on this large table in the library and used this 100-watt bulb under which to work. In summer, late sunlight would have helped, but in winter, painting under electric light, especially a 100-watt bulb with a limited spectrum, would have been a real challenge. It is a challenge for any painter to paint under this. Colors read incorrectly. Jung would have needed to constantly correct for the distortion in spectrum. I've tried to paint at night, and it's a royal failure. As we've seen, Jung designed the study to be a walled-off part of the library. The study had no external view. Jung designed it that way for internal, not external contemplation. It was here that he experienced visions, the invited ones and the uninvited, probably did his calligraphy at the standing desk, and often saw patients. You can see the tall standing desk, promoted from the gardener's shed, restored now, and back where Andreas deduced his grandfather would have placed it. He took this photograph and kindly let me use it. So now with his materials and his environment, Jung was ready to begin. He planned each page. This sketch is the only one left, but it shows how carefully Jung tried out size and spacing of calligraphy, chose a color palette for each page, drafted the majuscule, that's the capital letter, and designed its ornamentation. Makers of medieval manuscripts divided up work among 4 specialists. A scribe wrote the black minuscules. They're the black letters that you can see down at the bottom. A rubricator designed and rendered majuscules, the large capitals, diminuendos, which are the smaller letters that are up in the top right, the blue on the red, diminuendos, and important minuscules, the red ones that you see. An illustrator painted, designed majuscules, decorations, and images, and often a separate illuminator added the precious metals that gave the manuscripts their name. However, now think about this, Jung was all 4 of these, as we see here on folio 1. He was the scribe, the rubricator, the illustrator, and the illuminator. He worked on parchment at first, but his opaque gouache showed through the thin, transparent parchment. Here you see how the D on the recto there shows through on the verso, the back of the page. I want to trace it for you, but I'm sure you can see the reverse D on the right, middle right. He tried to overcome this by covering images that showed on the reverse side, by painting over them, or by just ignoring them, which is something that medieval manuscript makers often did. However, parchment presented him with yet another problem. His gouache didn't bind to it strongly, so the gouache flaked. So this was when Jung ordered a book of vellum paper from a bookbinder, the book known to us now as the Red Book. Well, the vellum resolved the transparency problem, but paint still flaked, as you can see, and it cracked, especially when Jung added extra pigment to increase intensity. Here you can see the green flaking and what's called craquelure, the crackling or cracking of the paint. As Jung knew, and we know, his paints were designed for hard surfaces, and Jung was using them here on a flexible surface. Here's the same page, hugely magnified at Digital Fusion in LA. Digital Fusion were the professionals chosen to digitize the Red Book. I went down there to study the original scans, and I was, from the magnifications, able to study Jung's techniques centimeter by centimeter. I asked Jennifer Mass to go there too, and here she is studying one of the scans of pages from which Jung took the paint flakes. While Jung seems to have planned each page, it would also seem that he didn't plan groups of pages. See the 3 dots on the vertical black line? They're in fact pinpricks made from when Jung used his awl to prick through a group of leaves to draw guidelines for calligraphy. However, he often decided to use part or all of a page for an illumination, as he did here. One of Jung's unique techniques was to build large fields from small cells. I might add, each of these images that you're seeing is 2 centimeters or less. In this particular majuscule or capital letter, we can glimpse the strong influence that Jung's medical studies had on him. He spent years studying tissue samples with this microscope, which he later gave to Yost. This page from Jung's own histology book shows the influence of his long hours of studying tissue samples. He superbly estimated the amount of paint he needed on his brush, the pressure he needed to release the paint, the amount of paint the vellum could take, and in 16 years, over 200 pages. He almost never overstepped the boundaries of one of these cells. As we look at these next magnified sections of illuminations, think about why Jung would go to such extraordinary lengths to render this work as he did. To do this demanded that he have unbroken concentration, unwavering commitment, fine technical style, and steady hand-eye coordination. He didn't just use cells for fields. He invented rules or constraints for a field of cells and then worked freehand following these rules. He built some illuminations from hundreds, usually thousands, of cells, often combining 3, 4, and 5-sided shapes, as you see here. He didn't draw a single cell at random. He drew each side of each cell in pencil, spontaneously, constantly adapting each to the space. In this next image, we see 4 of the main techniques that Jung used for drawing a field in this tiny crop from a large mandala. We can see his use of shape, size, color, and outlining. Let's look more at shape for a moment. Jung went to unparalleled lengths to change the shapes of cells from one illumination to the other, even within the same illumination, as he did here. This is page 135. He used organic and geometric shapes. He drew straight lines, circles, and certain angles with instruments, and everything else he drew freehand. I mentioned cell size. Jung consciously changed cell size in response, it would seem, to 2 factors: his overall design for the illumination and the proximity of cells to the center, as you can see here. Jung also chose to use many techniques for outlining, which he usually did last. On page 72, for example, he outlined in black. He outlined the circular lines by using an instrument, geometrical instrument, and the complex woven pattern by hand. He chose not to outline the dark brown and black cells in the outer circle. He often made these the same color and adjoining each other, but he painted each cell discretely. On the same page, he painted over 400 cells in graduated colors and shapes in 2 square centimeters, 400 cells here, but he chose not to outline them. Why did he paint over 400 separate cells when he could have graduated the colors much more simply? He also used green and gold outlining. Color, as I mentioned, is the third. Jung only ever used 1 pigment per cell, but that's the only universal rule that he applied. Sometimes he used color and cell formation in highly complex ways. Sometimes he'd choose a single color and use it transparently, and sometimes he painted cells using opaque technique, and sometimes he used both at once. Sometimes he'd only let himself paint cells the same color at a distance from one another. Sometimes he'd use the same color in adjoining cells, even placing 2 or 3 tones of the same color next to one another. He could have rendered these fields much more easily. Instead, he drew each cell in pencil, painted it, and then outlined or decided not to outline. He outlined in blue, black, and shades of green, as you see here. He also used different thicknesses to outline. And he used white to outline as well. While Jung's building from fields of cells is his most striking technique, he used others as effectively. He used transparent watercolor and opaque gouache techniques, moving effortlessly between them. Here, this is the center of page 135, he used transparent, semi-transparent, semi-opaque, and opaque techniques in an area smaller, as I said, than 2 centimeters square. Again, consider what his experience was doing this. Imagine yourself doing this. He chose this consciously. So just a brief look at 3 other techniques Jung used in the Red Book: perspective, use of shadow, and modeling. This early color of Jung's, early watercolor of Jung's, done in Paris, shows his innate command of all 3 of these skills. However, he rejected naturalistic ways of using them, or of using them at all, in the Red Book, in favor of stylized, mannered, or abstracted styles, more in the tradition of the medievalists. For example, here on page 115, he used perspective in ways that obey no laws of the outer world whatsoever. Nothing on this page is as it first appears. Take a look at the rear wall. Your eyes can feel how disorienting the perspective is. The rear wall looks as if it's a ramp, but it's attached to the side walls. It's impossible in anything but a vision or a dream. Jung used almost no cast shadows in the Red Book, except for this mandala on page 163. Here you can see that he shaded each building and also cast shadows from each. Interestingly, the only way that the shadows could actually be cast in this mandala, the whole mandala, is if the light shone on the buildings came from his own eyes. It took me a long time to figure this out, but I kept sitting there and thinking, why is he cast the shadow this way, and why over there is he cast the shadow this way? And finally, I realized that if I looked at it through my own eyes, and my eyes were casting the shadow, that's how it would appear. So in closing, let's just look briefly at how Jung used these 3 techniques, perspective, shadows, and modeling, in one iconic image in the Red Book. Jung chose a single light source. At first, it looks as though the light emanates from behind the tree. However, Jung painted some rays in front of the branches and some rays behind. So the light, in fact, emanates from some deep space in the great tree itself. He marked this light source in the tree with a tiny mandala, which he made in an extraordinarily time-consuming way. First, he scattered pale, translucent hues across a small field, working wet on wet, which is a watercolor technique he rarely used. After these areas dried, he outlined each color using a wet on dry transparent technique. Then he added a complex mandala in gold paint. This is a tiny area in a large illumination. Again, why such care and detail? Jung designed 16 rays to emanate from the light source in the most tedious, perilous way imaginable. He could have just used opaque white to paint these after he finished the illumination, but instead he penciled in 16 long, thin pairs of lines, you can see 3 of them here, and painted every cell and color field around the long, thin spaces, instead of just using opaque white paint to finish it off at the end. He painted 8 concentric fields of light around the light source. The further the field was from the light, the less organic it became and the more geometric he made it. And he lessened the strength of the light on each branch as it entered progressively distant concentric fields. And the branches, Jung shaped them, modeled their form naturalistically. He painted the side of the branch close to the light, lightest, and the side of the branch away from the light, darkest. However, not content to just model the branches, he penciled in the texture of the bark, tiny diamonds and tinier diamonds within the diamonds. Then he outlined each of these and varied the thickness of the outlining to turn the branch's form. And last, he shaded each area enclosed by the diamond. Where each tiny diamond turned towards the light, he made it lighter. Where it turned away from the light, he made it darker. The mathematics of this defy imagination. Jung always insisted he was not an artist. He was not making art when he made the Red Book. Well, what was he doing then? The mediums and techniques that we've seen that he used in the Red Book invoked, required, helped Jung to experience a sustained, concentrated, contemplative, meditative state. As you know, Jung stopped, attempted to recommence the Red Book, but stopped again. His inquiries and methods of documentation and ways of contemplation had shifted elsewhere, although he continued to use multiple mediums, including painting, wall painting, and stone carving. The Red Book painting and calligraphy belongs in this larger oeuvre that began when Jung was young and continued into his last years. Jung had begun the tower at Bollingen while he was still working on the Red Book. This is part of the first tower, the tower visited, it does have power. This is part of the first tower viewed from the loggia across the inner courtyard. Stone for the tower was delivered from several quarries, of which this is one. It's opposite Bollingen. Jung, who taught himself masonry, and his mason would order stone cut to strict specifications. Joost, by the way, took this lovely photograph. One day, this quarry delivered a stone not cut to their specification. The mason was not pleased. It was a perfect square. Jung took one look at it and said, "This is my stone, I must have it." He carved on 3 sides of it. He spent hours and hours carving it. And this carving, often referred to as the orphan stone, is the most widely known of his carvings. He also carved many bas-reliefs on the walls of the tower, often responding to what the stone itself seemed to be revealing. After Emma, his wife, died, he devoted months to absorbing her death and his new state, and immersed himself and found solace in carving this memorial to her. Jung chose his art mediums and his techniques because they required that he be deliberate, careful, slow, exact. Jung was not known for being a patient man, but he made every piece of his art in a way that required extraordinary patience. All his art techniques took him a long, long time. And as you just glimpsed, what took Joost and me back to Bollingen, or took me to Bollingen in the first place in 2012, was very different from what took us back in 2015 after the research findings. To paraphrase Eliot, we did not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring was to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Well, I hope you feel as though you've been a friendly ghost, a very quiet ghost, peeking respectfully over Jung's shoulder. Helene, Joost's mother and Jung's youngest daughter, told Andreas once that her father only let her do her homework in the library if she were very quiet and certainly never bumped him. All art forms for Jung were more than art. They were a means of concentration, inspiration, expression, slowing down, a practice of patience, meditation, reflection, and theorizing about what the world of the unconscious might be. What could have threatened to drag him drowning into the dark waters of the unconscious carried him instead. In Küsnacht and at Bollingen by the lake, and always in sight of the Prealps, Jung found his soul, his own myth, his own forms of contemplative art processes. He engaged with his inner world, absorbed it, and theorized about it. He considered that the years of his greatest involvement with his inner world laid the foundation for everything that followed in his professional and personal life. He urged his patients and us to do likewise for ourselves. Ironically, I don't think he'd be too keen on all the fuss that we make of his red book, frankly. He would exhort us, as he did his patients, to find our own means of going on our own journey, so that the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we began and to know the place for the first time. Well, thank you all. Skip, shall we take a short break and then we'll pick up again?
Yes, we certainly can, and maybe Tim can provide some comments while we take a break.
Okay.
I'll just stop your video, Jill.
Thanks.
So,
Okay, fine. I'll be back in 5 minutes.
okay.
Yeah, anybody that wants to take a break and go to the bathroom or get a drink or something, feel free. I'm so grateful for hearing this Jill's adventure, and as an artist, I have to say I'm really captivated by all of these details. And one thing that I experience is this intense sense of unfairness that, you know, this brilliant man got so many different talents. And as an artist, I look at what he did and realize the depth of his dedication and his ability to carry out these amazing paintings that are absolutely impressive on any professional spectrum. Even though he's not a professional painter, he exactly acts like one, because not only his materials are really pristine and well thought out, but he goes to this incredible depth in realizing his vision. So I think about myself, you know, if I was painting some of these images, I would take the shortcuts for the most part. I wouldn't spend all of this time, you know, making sure that each little cell was a different color and it matched the whole scheme and would vary from the distance from the middle of the mandala or whatever. That attention to detail not only creates a really stunning artwork, but it also gives the capacity to enter that very, very contemplative place. Reminds me of the activity that Jung did oftentimes, you know, sitting at the shore of the lake and just doing these little waterworks, you know, pushing the dirt around and making little bays and rivers and whatnot, which is something I've done all my life, you know, mostly as a little kid, but as an adult, sometimes when I'm trying to get water to move out of a driveway or something, I end up playing with that stuff. And I realize how valuable that is as a contemplative exercise. Well, in approaching an artwork, that contemplation also gets you into the unconscious where the richest material is. And so one of the things that I find so inspirational about Jung's art is it gives me the opportunity to scrutinize my own technique and figure out where are the places where I can kind of doodle in the margins or do some repetitive action that would help me simply fall into the contemplative state, because so much of my personal approach to art is so intentional, so focused on getting a certain form or a certain emotion or something like that. So I found that really inspirational. And again, I'm just so grateful that Dr. Mellick was able to do this. I'm so glad somebody did it, because I had no idea when I first got the Red Book that there was all this other material that's available for us to realize. You know, the art is very impressive, but for instance, on the folio 1, that big illuminated D, and the red letters to the right of that, I had no idea until I read Jill's book that there are all these little very, very detailed illustrations in the margins of those letters. And when she enlarged some of those in her book, I was just astonished that these very, very detailed landscapes and whatnot appear on this page. And I looked at the page, and at first I thought, you know, she must have got the page number wrong, because I don't see these incredible landscapes. And finally, I looked at that folio 1 very, very carefully, and I started to see, oh, they're in the margins. They're just like decorative elements that you would totally miss if you didn't really, really study the page. So that's the kind of detail that Jill helped illuminate for us. I think our 5 minutes is up. I've just sort of filled it up with my own fascination with this stuff. But if anybody has questions, please let us know. As I said before, you can type it in the Zoom chat or on the YouTube chat, and we'll try to get those addressed. If you are courageous in front of this audience of, I don't know, 100 people or more, and just want to come out and ask your questions verbally, that's fine. Try to raise your hand so we can kind of manage everybody. Dr. Mellick, when you come back, let me know that you're here, just so I know.
There she is.
Okay.
She's
okay,
back.
You're back. So here's a question from John Jackson. He's asking if you could speak about the calligraphy styles. There are two prominent styles, the Gothic and the more cursive style. What do you think influenced that second style?
That's a good question, John.
Just before you answer that, Jill, would you mind stopping your screen share so that we can see you in speaker view again? And I accidentally muted you just now, so you'll have to unmute yourself again.
Okay, stop
I'd
sharing.
like to just say it's Sherry,
Yeah,
who's
thank
the
you.
calligrapher. She's been a
Okay,
calligrapher
now I
all of her
can't see
life.
anybody.
And the question comes from.
Oops.
Okay, now we have you in speaker view.
You do? Good.
On my end.
I don't. Hold on just a second. Let me get rid of this.
So you can go up in the right corner and you'll find a little space for speaker view. If you move your cursor up, there's 9 little squares together. It looks like a telephone keypad.
And speaker view.
Just click on the 9 little squares.
On the line? Or click on my square?
Well, I have you on speaker view.
There.
You big when you talk, Joe.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's Andrea here.
Okay, is that right now? Good.
Yes.
Okay, so John, to your question, I'm sorry, my technology skills have a certainly limited time period. Certainly the calligraphy, I've got a whole section in the book, John, on the calligraphy. And he started with the black letter, as you know, and then moved to the second style, he didn't always do that. I mean, it wasn't a sudden change, as I'm sure you've noticed. Sometimes he would use one style and then go back to the other, but there becomes more and more of the other style. I think it was a little easier. Remember, this is over 16 years he was doing this. And I think that, this is a guess, that having had a wonderful time learning calligraphy when I was younger, I would certainly say that the second style is a lot easier to do than the black letter. What do you think?
Well, the question came from Sherry, who's been a calligrapher all of her life, so I'll let her speak.
Okay.
So yes, the Gothic is very
I'd love to know
slow.
what you think.
The Gothic lettering is very slow. The other
Yeah.
one, is it derived from his handwriting or is it based on a certain style of the time?
His handwriting is right at the end of the book, where he attempts to get engaged with the book again, and you see his actual handwriting in the last couple of pages only.
Mhm.
The rest was not the style of the time.
Mm. So its influence, I wasn't sure what influenced that second style, or what is it called? Is it, I mean, we know the Gothic. Mm.
Well, I would have to spend more time than you want me to right now, looking up what I said about that.
Oh, okay. It's in your book. I'll get to see it.
It is in the book, but there were, and I did speak with a wonderful calligrapher in Zurich, who's one of the curators at the museum in Zurich where Jung had his exhibit. Can someone help me with that? It begins with Rietberg Museum. And we talked about this. But one thing that's sort of interesting, and I will quote this to you, Sherry, from the book. The black letter type first used by Gutenberg took on several forms with slight variations. Textualis or textura and Fraktur. The use of Fraktur continued in Germany well into the 20th century. And in 1928, more than half of all books were still printed in black letter. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the move against Gothic gathered momentum and spurred on by international trade and the movement and political concerns of artists who had been influenced by Edward Johnson, who was the calligrapher who first wrote, as I'm sure you know, in London and made calligraphy something that many art students wanted to learn who never wanted to learn it before, and Eric Gill, and the broader sweep of the Italian futurists and Bolsheviks. The Nazis thought Roman text degenerate, believing only traditional Gothic texts could fully express the purity of the nation. The Reich propaganda not only used Gothic lettering for its message, but made it the message itself. One slogan read, "Be German, even in script."
Wow.
Yeah, interesting. I don't think that particular part had anything to do with Jung because he finished the book well before that, but it's fascinating to look at the cultural, as I'm sure you know, being a longtime calligrapher, to look at the cultural influence over calligraphy styles.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't want to take up too much of your time, but how much was he influenced by Eric Gill, who was also a stone carver?
I don't know about Eric Gill. I could talk. We don't have any. One of the interesting things, Sherry, is that in Jung's library, there is not a single how-to book. There are no how to do masonry, how to do calligraphy. I was so sure, particularly given that Anna Simon translated Edward Johnson's book into German, and it was flowing like wildfire through most of the European art schools, that Jung would have read it. And And the standing desk, I looked at the angle that Edward Johnson recommended, and the angle in the standing desk, they're the same. However, I couldn't prove it because there's no book.
Fascinating.
You know, I've got high suspicions about the influence of Edward Johnson. I couldn't tell you about Gill.
Mhm.
Again, I think that's really unfair that he has no how-to book. You know.
Of course, the best fantasy about that we can have is that he had them and he threw them out. But I don't, honestly, I don't think so. I think he was just a polymath. And he was one of those people who could look at things and figure out how it was done and do it.
Right.
I mean, the mason at Bollingen had the highest respect for his masonry skills.
Oh, I don't doubt it. Well, I assume that Sherry that asked another question about these figures that appear on 94 and 95 that are like ideograms
Mhm.
that don't have any, that he must have made up. Do you have any thoughts about those, where those came from?
They were, to my knowledge, they were as much part of his expression of his inner visions as anything else was. They were a very strange series from my point of view. What do you think, Tim?
Well, I just wonder if he's not making up his own ideograms. He thinks of a certain concept and says, well, how would I write this if I was inventing something? That's what they look like to me.
That's
But again, really, really creative. I mean, I've done things like this, invented languages and whatnot, but I tend to do kind of the same forms over and over. So it looks very, looks like a consistent design, but it's not very creative like this.
Of course, as you know, in the Red Book, there are lots of, I've lost the word for it, Tim, help me. When you write a language that isn't a language, there's a whole...
You're talking about automatic writing?
No, asemic writing.
Asemic.
Asemic. Mhm.
Yeah, asemic writing.
That's what I thought that might have been. Mhm.
A whole Twitter thing about people who do asemic writing. It's just fascinating to look at it. And we could say that Jung did asemic writing when he wrote some of his symbols around the bottom of things that look as though they should be able to be read, but you can't. But this is a different thing that you're talking about, Tim.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting thought. I'll give it some thought.
Well, so, and you mentioned the kind of decorative, these decorations that he made that are not so much geometric, they're more like lettering, but they're not letters. I don't know how to describe that.
Mm-hmm.
But every so often you'll see in a border somewhere this sort of script-like shapes that he creates.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely fascinating.
It is.
So,
maybe one day somebody will write a 700-page book about having translated it.
Nice dissertation topic for somebody to tackle.
Not going to be me.
Nancy has her hand up, Tim, so maybe we should.
Yeah, Nancy, go ahead.
For a minute.
Well, I'm listening to the details here of the pigment and shapes and that kind of thing. And what caught my ear was that you said he was not patient. Jung was not patient. And of course, these tiny designs that are only 2 centimeters, that has to go against his natural self that's not patient. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
I do, and I'm sure some of the others of you do too. Jung was not known for being a patient man, and he very clearly stated in various places the importance of patience, of slowing down. And everything in the Red Book is designed to slow one down. Every way of rendering every single thing. That was one of those first things that struck me. That there's so.
It's 1 o'clock.
So exactly, it's contra natura. It's exactly the opposite of what he was. And I think of in the matter of spirit on page 225, I start that with the quote from Luke, Luke 21:19, in patientia vestra posse debitus animus vestras, in patience. And it's a little questionable. I've seen about 10 different translations of that from the Latin. But it's in patience we have or find or gain or know our souls.
Mm.
And so everything he did was devoted in the art realm, required that kind of patience. There wasn't a single thing that I've seen to date that could have been just, whipped off.
That's like an antidote to modern civilization, because everything we do has to be so fast paced. And it feels like, man, that's good medicine for any of us.
Yeah. I think it's exactly what you said, that he wasn't not being a patient man. This forced him to develop that side of himself. And in developing that side of himself, he was able to find something inside that he'd not found otherwise.
Wow, that's great.
Thank you so much.
I've got a question for you. You mentioned in your book that after the Red Book went on display at the Venice Biennale, they determined that when it came back, it really should rest for a few years.
Yeah.
And it made me think, man, this sounds like an elderly person.
Yeah.
Why in the world would a physical object have to rest? I wonder if you could just comment about that.
I loved that when I heard that, Tim. That was part of what terrified us too, because yes, it's going to go to the Venice Biennale, but then when it comes back, I was told, I've got it in writing somewhere, I was told it has to rest for a few. On a very practical level, the book needed to be in its pelican case, be in a steady humidity, not be moved around. You saw how I was pointing out that the pigments that he used were not designed for use on vellum. And so every time a page is turned or used, it stresses the paint. And so for it to go back into the vault for a few years and rest allows some of that to recohere, if there's such a word, but I just made it up.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I had the most extraordinary experience last year when I joined the Jungs down in Santa Barbara for the Art and Psyche conference. To my surprise, the book was there. So I guess a few years was, 20, whatever it was, 5 years, because it was there. And a lot of his other work was there too. And I went into this art gallery that's associated with the university, and I was alone with the Red Book and with all of his other painting. And I thought, this, how can this be? But oddly enough, there'd been a breakdown in communication between the advertising and marketing for the museum part and the conference itself. So even people who were at the conference weren't fully aware that the Red Book and all these other goodies were there. But it was just a remarkable experience to go and look now with different eyes. But I was thinking, what did they have to do to get it to Santa Barbara? And what a different environment from Zurich. It would be stressful.
Yeah.
I don't know, you're a painter and an artist, but wouldn't you say that leaving something sometimes just to leave it alone lets it almost cook or mature?
Well, I wouldn't say that physically, but certainly psychologically. I'm just finishing a painting I've been working on for about 15 years, and it, you know, it needs to cook for a while, just psychologically. But I've never thought about this idea of letting, you know, a physical object just be left alone for a while to cure in some way. But it's a fascinating idea.
It's extraordinarily fragile. The book.
Yeah.
When I was speaking with Hugh Milstein, who was the one who digitized the book in a week. They had a week to digitize the whole thing perfectly. And he described the moment, and I do include this in the book, where it was brought out for the first time for 50 years. It was brought in a separate car, attended by insurance people and everything, to the atelier where they were going to do the work. They had designed a stand for it so that they would never stress the pages or the spine, and they would tilt it like this. And he said, when they first took it out of the Pelican box and put it up on the paper and then opened it, he said the pages began to turn themselves.
Oh my gosh.
And he said, I'm not, you know, a woo-woo person, but he said it was really hard to feel. And I think everybody in the room, and Ulrich was there, and Joost was there, and Andreas was there, and Soni Shamdasani and others. He said, I think we all felt the same. It felt as though somebody's hand was turning it. But on a very scientific level, it tells you the influence just of moving it and changing its position. How much influences the humidity influence the turning of those pages.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I see that, Evangeline, you've got your hand up, but I've had a hand up by Heidi for a while. Do you have a question?
Hi, Heidi.
You
there, Heidi?
You need to unmute, Heidi.
It was unmuted.
There
Sorry.
you go.
There.
Hi, Jill.
Hi.
Great to see you. This is just fascinating, and I just can't believe the timing as I wrote you. So my question is, why did he study skin? Why did he go into the cells? Why did he choose cells? Why do you think that he was so micro-oriented?
Did you say, why did he study skin at the beginning?
Yeah, didn't he study skin to look at cells? Didn't I understand that correctly from
When he was in his very long and very intense period of training to become a doctor, they were already using microscopes and studying tissue.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
And so his book on histology, his main book, Joost actually said to me, ask about a book on histology, because of course he's a physician, and he said you'll see something, because I raised this with Thomas as well, who's the current head of the foundation. And so they thought it viable enough, a theory, that his long years of studying and probably drawing of what he saw under the microscope led him to be influenced, as I showed you in that one majuscule, by particularly brain matter. he loved histology.
Mhm.
He really did. It was,
I'm going to look that up.
yeah. And then I think this is purely guesswork on my part, Heidi.
Mhm.
I'm going to just say that I think that he probably had drawn for years, drawn images. He had to look through the microscope that U.S.'s got now.
Mhm.
And he'd drawn these images of, striations, of muscle striations, of brain matter and everything else. So that was in his hand. It was in his hand memory
Mhm.
at that point. And then why did he draw cells? Well, that takes us into the other. I mean, I call them cells, and that's what sort of actually clued me into, cells has got two meanings here.
Mhm.
But you can't draw anything like that fast, as you know, being an artist yourself.
Mhm.
It's a perfect way to slow you down.
Mhm.
And also, one could theorize that he was building a map of an internal world, just as we were mapping our physical internal world.
Mhm.
And so it fitted symbolically in that way.
You just said what my next question was, like, that seems like going into, sorry to take everybody's time, but it seems like going into that depth of the cell structure of tissue, and then the inner world of the subconscious being so nebulous that giving some structure to it, it makes sense.
I think that's I would not disagree with that theory.
It's so cool.
Nobody will know,
Yeah.
but I think it's a real possibility. That, I mean, how do you begin to map something there's no map, there's no,
Right. Thank
and
you so
besides
much.
which, this is only yours. That was
Yeah.
his big point all the time. This is his inner world. What's yours?
Mhm.
What does yours look like
Right.
in images, in symbols, in dance, in whatever form that you find to express it? That's
Mhm.
really what he wanted with a lot of people. When I saw those paintings up in the archive, I was struck by how many of his analysans had adopted his style.
Mhm.
And he never suggested that, ever. He wanted people to find their own. And there's I fell upon this fascinating story. Let me just see if I can find it easily here for a minute. The trouble with this book is it's so darn heavy. I never set out to have a 4-pound book, sort of as bad as the Red Book itself. As I say, it's very dangerous to the nose and the toes. So it's right towards the end. He tells this strange story here. I think Skip, is it okay if I just share this for a minute?
Surely.
He wrote this in Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. It's a quote from that. Here it is. There once was a queer old man who lived in a cave where he had sought refuge from the noise of the villagers. He was reputed to be a sorcerer, and therefore he had disciples who hoped to learn the art of sorcery from him. But he himself was not thinking of any such thing. He was only seeking to know what it was that he did not know, but which he felt certain was always happening. After meditating for a very long time on that which is beyond meditation, he saw no other way of escape from his predicament than to take a piece of red chalk and draw all kinds of diagrams on the walls of the cave in order to find out what that which he did not know might look like. After many attempts, he hit on the circle. That's right, he felt. And now, a quadrangle inside of it, which made it better still. His disciples were curious, but all they could make out was that the old man was up to something, and they would have given anything to know what he was doing. But when they asked him, "What are you doing there?" he made no reply. Then they discovered the diagrams on the wall and said, "That's it." And they all imitated the diagrams. But in so doing, they turned the whole process upside down without noticing it. They anticipated the result in the hope of making the process repeat itself, which had led to that result. This is how it happened then and how it still happens today.
That's a great segue into my question, which I'd like to ask you. This is my big question, which is pardon?
I better take a breath.
So at the beginning of this book, you mentioned very briefly an interaction you had with a Pueblo woman, I believe, who may have been an artist. And I was hoping, I haven't gotten to the point yet, whether you do or not, discuss that a little further. I understand it may have been an Alessand, but I wonder if you'd say a little bit more of that, because it seems to me that was a prelude to what you did with the Red Book Hours in terms of understanding the process. And particularly, I do want to read one short passage from the Red Book, which is related to this quote: "My friends, it is wise to nourish the soul, otherwise you will breed dragons and devils in your heart." And so I wonder if you would talk about how creativity is related to our mental health.
Whoa. In 3 words or less, right?
Right.
I'm looking for the bit, because there's so much of the Pueblo. Here we go. What I mentioned in here particularly, the Pueblo people have taught me so much about creative process, Skip. I've had the good fortune to spend 25 years going back and forth and have many friends down there, and they've been very patient with my stupidities, and also had the great fortune to be able to co-write a biography of one of the Pueblo women artists. She's an elder and a leader in her tribe. What I mention here is that in the 8 northern tribes, there are 19 Pueblo groups, and the 8 northern ones speak Tewa, or most anyway, not all of them. And Tewa in particular has no word for art. And I heard this one night. It was during just about this time of year. I was down there for the what's called Indian Market, which can't be held this year, of course, except virtually. And I went to a talk by Rena Swensel Naranjo, who's one of the extraordinarily creative Naranjo family. And Rena is a cultural anthropologist, as well as being a potter. And she said simply, there is no word in Tewa for art. The closest word that we have, and every time I've tried to pronounce this to my Tewa friends, they get the giggles, but I'm still working on it. Bolwaha, and it means water, wind, breath. And it describes the creativity. It's like chi or ruach that moves through us all. And it's that inner experience. It's the process itself. And then it's expressed in a pot or in something else, or in ceremonial dress that's made, or a painting, or whatever. But the most important thing, and it really would be considered to be to do with mental health, is that one is in touch with that powaha, with that water, wind, breath, creative spirit that runs through all of us. A colleague of mine did her doctoral research on attitudes towards health in Pueblo artists, which touches closely on what you're discussing. And Jean noticed something that was very unusual. I got to accompany her on quite a number of the interviews or talks or whatever. And one of the interesting things about the Pueblos is you can't ask any questions. If you ask questions, you're really considered pretty dumb. There was a very famous anthropologist who went down to the Pueblos and was interviewing the woman about whom we wrote a book. And she said to us one day, you know, she came and she talked with Juan, who was her husband, who was the head of the Hunt tribe for a particular Pueblo. And she was asking him a lot of questions. And there was a little pause. And then she said, you think being an anthropologist, she'd know better. I love it. So it's a little bit of an exercise in patience, the word of the day, to learn what one needs to learn. But I was grateful to Rena for that evening when she described that. And a perfect example of it is her brother, Michael Naranjo, is when he came back from Vietnam, he was a painter when he left for Vietnam. He came back from Vietnam blinded. And he became a sculptor. And his sculptures are extraordinary. And I've been in his tower, which has no windows, that would cast any light on the work that he's doing. And he sculpts human figures and so on. Anyway, at Indian Market one year, I was at the Naranjo booth, and he was Rose, he was the matriarch. And Rose, I was looking at various pieces, and often the families have small pieces that are done by the grandchildren and so on. But there was this exquisite little bear. And I said, oh, that's lovely, Rose. Who did that? And I was thinking, which one of the grandchildren? Because I knew most of the family. And she said, oh, that's Michael. Well, now her husband was Michael, but I knew he didn't do any art. And I was trying to think now, which grandkid is Michael and things. And finally she said, Michael. I said, you mean your son? And she said, yes, he did it when he was about 12. Now, Michael was about 4 booths down, and his work was selling for 50,000 up. And she was selling this little piece. I think I paid $40 for it. And I thought about that. It was the day after Rena, his sister, had spoken. And I thought, how can a mother sell a piece that her son made when he could see and was 12? And then I thought, Jill, you're missing the point. He still has that powaha. This is simply a byproduct.
Yeah.
And in that way, the Red Book was a byproduct.
Surely. Fascinating.
Great.
Well, you've given us a couple of hours here. There's one thing that I wanted to be sure to share with as many of the audience and with you as possible. I think you've seen it, but I've owned the Red Book for 10 years and I have always struggled with it. But when I read your book, I got interested in standing desks again. And I searched all over for standing desks, and I even ordered one from the library store, which is a dictionary stand, and they wanted as much as the desk cost to deliver it. So I canceled that order. And then I realized it was a lectern that I wanted. And so this is the lectern I purchased from Amazon. It's made by Oklahoma Sound. And this is your book on the lectern, and obviously the red book also displayed there. But I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
Because
I'm honored.
I've wanted to have I've wanted to have a standing desk since my colonel got one in Vietnam 50 years ago.
Really?
I finally got one last week, thanks to your book.
Oh, I'm pleased, and I hope that the red book usually has pride of place on the top.
Yeah.
Mine is the also ran underneath. So
Evangeline has had her hand up for about a half an hour, so why don't we give her a chance to
of course, and I am, I know many of you probably need to finish up at 1:30, and that's fine. I still actually have a little bit of energy, so if anybody wants to stay on, I'm happy to stay for about another 10 minutes or so to
Okay, terrific.
any extra questions. You've been very patient.
Go ahead, Evangeline.
Angeline, was it?
We can't hear you, Evangeline, so you need to.
Oh, Evangeline,
unmute.
hi.
Good with this stuff. Can you
Now
hear
we
me?
can hear you.
Oh, yes,
Yep.
very good. I'm very pleased to meet you,
Wish I
Jill.
could see you.
Oh, well, I'm here somewhere.
Good.
Um,
Okay.
Thank you so much for your wonderful work and for your presentation. I have
Oh,
two
thank you.
things.
Yes.
And I'll be as quick as possible. As you were talking, it occurred to me how beautiful it is that the Red Book needs to rest, or needed to rest. And I understand all the technology of how the paint needs to recohere and how the humidity and everything.
Mhm.
That's part of it. But it occurred to me that I think this is the spirit of Mercurius that actually lives in matter, and that needs a rest. Because
Oh,
it
I
all
love that.
bad.
Thank you for that. That's very, very nice. That's a gift to us all.
Thank you. And then I thought, I feel like crying really, because I'm thinking of the pelican box. I've never heard that phrase before. And I'm thinking of the pelican that is always trying to feed its young at great sacrifice. And somehow that to me is connected to the fact that the Red Book needs a rest.
Oh, I love these symbolic connections. Thank you so much for them.
Well, thank you. You gave them to me. And then I have a question about the letter D.
Yes. Which one? The one that looks like the medical one?
Well, it's right at the beginning.
Oh, that one.
The capitalized letter D. I can't read the word that it's attached to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know the word it's attached to, but I have always pondered on the letter D as really the delta letter. And the Great Mother, to me, it is sort of like the Great Mother Delta opens up this incredible piece of work. I just wondered what you thought.
Thank you. It had never occurred to me, and I think you've enriched all of us with these associations. They're wonderful.
Well, good. And thank you so much again, Jill. I'm delighted to meet you.
And you, and you. You know, I was thinking about that D. Isn't that the one in which it starts underwater and then goes to the heavens?
I don't know. I don't have it there. Do you?
It is. Okay. Well, it just sort of backs up what you're saying in a way, Evangeline, because it's a picture of the entire world.
Yes.
If you look at that, the illumination within it starts in, actually why I wore this scarf today, because
Oh, and I'm so glad I went and got mine to put on when I saw you had yours.
but I realized that I knew I needed to wear something that felt right for the day.
Yes.
And this is called From the Sea to the Sky.
Oh, I love it.
And in that D, if you look at it, it starts with all of the creatures underwater, and then it goes up. Thank you. Thank you very much, Skip. yeah, if you really go in there and look at those very, very closely,
Yes.
you end up not just with those, but then you've got the land and the what the Pueblo people would call the fourth world. And then it moves up and actually extends not only to the sky, but into the astrological symbols as well. So it's going to the ether. And I would add on a historical level that just about anybody who was studying medicine at the time that Jung was very interested in nature as a whole. And Jung certainly was.
Yes.
And I think it's embodied in that first D.
Yes,
And
I hadn't
certainly
seen
what you just said about it is exactly right. It's a lovely addition. Thank you.
and just to bear in mind that I was just looking at some research recently, 400 deltas of the world are in dire condition right now from pollution. And so this takes on for me a very urgent image in a way. So thank you very much, Jill.
Thank you. Yeah.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Say, I want to just mention that those of you who are on Zoom, we're getting some great comments from Jan, who is like a Jung librarian herself. That would be good to. I'm just going to copy the chat and read it later, but she always provides really great stuff.
Is there something you want to share about that, Skip?
Well, one of them
So,
had to do with the reading that you did earlier from Ion, or from Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. But do you want to read those, Tim, or?
is there something I just turned on the chat. I couldn't
Well,
before, otherwise I couldn't concentrate. But
yeah, after this, I will have the chat in text form, and I'll be able to send it to you. So you don't have to get it.
If somebody's got a particular question that they want to ask me,
Well, I do have one that.
very happy to answer it later too. It doesn't have to be during our group time. Sorry, Tim. Go on.
You said kind of in passing at one point that the sirens are the muses of the underworld in your book. Do you remember that passage? It's on 215.
You know, that I had the oddest experience with this book, Tim. I look at it and I sometimes wonder who wrote it. I really do. It's an odd thing. must have dropped into some other place. And I had no idea of that. Now, granted, I've been through quite a lot since I wrote it, but
it comes in the context of
sirens.
the chapter on toxicity.
What page is it? Because I've got my
It's 215.
215.
And you said that there's a certain, I can't remember if you said this or if I was just thinking it, that there's a kind of attraction to this intense pigment, many of which are toxic. And I wonder if there isn't some kind of psychological meaning to the fact that we are really attracted to the intensity of those colors, that almost by design is a kind of poison.
I think there's an interesting symbolic connection there. Historically, for example, Sheila's green, that beautiful green, which is arsenic based, Jung didn't have any idea, nor did any of the, Impressionist painters who were using it, that it was toxic. And the Eurogold, I don't think that Jung, as a good scientist and everything else, would have used this had he been fully aware of what he had. I got a woman called Monona Rasool, who's the expert in this country on toxins in art, on stage everywhere. And I gave her all the information I had and said, can you tell me what you would make from this? This is the space in which Jung was working and this sort of thing. And so a lot of my understanding about those things came from that. If there's unconsciously, there could well be some sort of attraction to the danger and so on. And no, we wouldn't get a color like Sheila's green again because it can't be made.
Heavy metal colors like cobalt and
Yeah,
cadmium.
Yeah, and I'm terrible, you know, I'm sure you're better than I, and those of you who are painters who are here, I try to be good about using gloves or using a mask or something like that when I'm using pastels or things, and cadmium and anything that might get through the fingers. I'm just shocking at it because I can't feel it. I need to be in touch with the medium itself.
right. I noticed that Valeria Bresson had her hand up.
Oh,
and
hi, Valeria.
Do you have a question, Valeria?
I do. So nice to meet you.
Hi, Valeria.
Thank you so much for such a beautiful work. This is just really amazing. It's truly, I think it's truly a gift for all of us, artists or not. I'm wondering, going through this experience and spending so much time of digging into his life, how this has changed yourself and your artistic work.
It's a really good question. I've not been asked it before, so give me a minute to reflect on that. Two images come to my mind, and so I'll just go with those first. Once when I was in Kauai, and I was really trying to understand the way the illuminations were made in the Red Book. I'd ordered, there are actually two bits to this. First of all, I'd ordered pigments from Kine. They're still extant, and they have a branch in America. And I ordered a number of expensive pigments. And I thought that I was going to do that, use them. However, I opened the first one and I couldn't even speak. Speaking of toxins, I lost my voice. No powder at all seemed to come off it. But within a minute, I couldn't speak. And I thought, you know, my research devotion stops here. But then the second thing is, when I was in Hawaii once, I thought, all right, I'm going to trace or copy one of these, I think it was the serpent, the underwater serpent painting, and see if I can replicate it to see if I can feel anything inside. And I have a lot of patience when I'm doing art. I could not do it. It drove me nuts. And I had to stop. What I then would say is the other image that came up to me is that when I'm doing work at the moment that makes no sense to me at all, I think that spending as much time as I did with the Red Book and realizing the courage that Jung had to make it and the devotion, that it's all right for me to do work that might be absolutely pointless. I don't know. It's not mine to know, but it's mine to do it and express it. So it's a kind of humility, I think. It's brought more humility to my work. I'd like to think so.
Thank you. That's wonderful. It's a wonderful work. Amazing.
Say, speaking of the pigments, I wanted to read a little passage from your book. Just as each patient has a unique way of creating a story and each painting has its own style, so too every pigment has its unique characteristics. Not to know the different characteristics is the equivalent of conducting a psychotherapy session where the patient's personality is irrelevant to the treatment. I think that is just so right on and so beautiful.
Do you find that for yourself?
Well, you know,
pigments?
my particular situation is I'm mostly a sculptor, and I've painted for years and years, but I don't have the capacity, I don't have the natural color sense that a lot of people do, like I think Jung had.
Yeah.
And so I really have to struggle when it comes to color. I really have to think about it. I can't just.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, one of Jung's more famous and short quotes is, he said, "I have a certain sense of color." It's a delightful one because it's so modest.
Yeah.
But that is my experience, that each pigment, each paint, whether it's indigo, for example, I'm in love with indigo, and understanding how it spreads in water, understanding how each pigment, because of its chemical properties, of course, but I mean, we're all cells and physiology too, but it fascinates me as much as working with people, that each one is unique. Each one is absolutely unique. Not to understand its uniqueness is to lose that intimate respect.
There's an interesting comment here on the YouTube chat, which is from somebody who calls himself Carl G. Jung. So it is, the de-illumination is very reminiscent to me of the alchemical image, the Flammarion woodcut. And I pulled the Flammarion woodcut up on Wikipedia just so you can see what he's talking about. And there it is. And of course, this is over on the right side is the woodcut that is being referred to. And
now,
this,
I can't see it because the people are showing on the side.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. But you
move it over a little.
If I move it over a little. Okay, let me try that.
Might not work.
Let's see here. Okay, I've moved it. Can you see it better now?
A little bit.
Okay, well, basically, you've seen it many times before because people use it in. And what it is looking into another dimension. This man is in his everyday dimension, and he's putting his head through into the dimension of the universe and the unconscious. In this, that's what's depicted here.
What a wonderful parallel.
Yeah. Okay. I had I thought it would be interesting if I would share one passage here that related to breeding dragons and devils in the heart, because there are a couple of interesting footnotes in it that might be useful. And so I'm going to put I scanned the page of the Red Book Reader's Edition here, and it's going to be a little small for you, so I'm going to read the footnotes. But these are footnote 42, and this is in a passage called "Refining the Soul." In her diary notes, Carrie Baines commented on this passage. What struck me especially was what you said about the build, the image being half the world. That is the thing that makes humanity so dull. They have missed the understanding that thing, the world that is the thing that holds them wrapped, das Bild. they have never seriously considered unless they have been poets. And that was from February 8th, 1924. And then the specific footnote to this sentence, my friends, it is wise to nourish the soul, otherwise you will breed dragons and devils in your heart. And here's what it says. The draft continues. This parable about refinding the soul, my friends, is meant to show you that you have only seen me as half a man, since my soul had lost me. I am certain that you did not notice this, because how many are with their souls today? Yet without the soul, there is no path that leads beyond these times. In her diary notes, Carrie Baines comment on this passage on February 8th, 1924. I came to your conversation with your soul. All that you say is said in the right way and is sincere. It is no cry of the young man awakened into life, but that of the mature man who has lived fully and richly in ways of the world, and yet knows almost abruptly one night, say, that he has missed the essence. The vision came at the height of your power, when you could have gone on just as you were with perfect worldly success. I do not know how you were strong enough to give it heed. I'm really for everything you say and understand it. Everyone who has lost the connection with his soul or has known how to give it life ought to have a chance to see this book. Every word so far lives for me and strengthens me just where I feel weak. But as you say, the world is very far away from it in mood today. That does not matter too much. A book can swing even a whole world if it is written in fire and blood. If it is written in fire and blood. So.
That's great.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate your joining us, and our thanks to Ann Ulanoff, who pressed me to invite you to talk with us, and I really appreciate it. And I'm sure many of the rest of the others here appreciate it.
Well, it's a joy to have been with you all and to share some of the journey. Really,
Yeah.
really is. It's lovely and lovely to see so many faces that I know, including a cousin from Russia.
and this book, you know, I have a honored place for it in my house, but I just when I opened it the first time, it just blew me away. I mean, I felt like the skin was blown off my bones, and so it's a book that I hope everyone will go get a copy of or take a look at least. Make your library buy one. Because it's a very powerful book, and your years of work on it certainly show in it. There's no doubt about that.
Yes, very much. Thank you for all of this.
Thank you, Skip.
I just wanted to add, Jan put another Jung quote in the chat. Art derives its life from and expresses the conditions of our time. In that sense, art is prophetic.
Yes, indeed. And one can go to Tim Holmes's Patreon page and see just how prophetic it is becoming in our day and age. But in any case, are there any other points or questions in the audience before we wrap up? You can just unmute yourself and speak up if you'd like to. Edward Gordon.
Go ahead. Edward has got his hand up.
Hey, hi, Jill. Laraji here.
Hi, Laraji.
Hi. I'm just curious about the word aslemic. How do you pronounce and spell that?
Asemic, A-S-E-M-I-C. I.C. And I am willing to bet that you have done it at some point.
Maybe that's why I'm curious about the word.
I bet it's what you've done in music, but it's probably what you've done also in images in some way. But it's fascinating field. ASEMIC, asemic
Thank you.
writing.
And I do have a couple of examples on my screen that I can share with you. First of all is this one, where you can see the hieroglyph that is put up here. And this was something that that Tim was talking about earlier on these particular images in the Red Book. And I've always taken these as, well, this I would take now, but for the first time I'm seeing it as an eyeball, because you're seeing all the blood vessels in the eyeball. But I've always taken it as other things that were pressing in on Jung one way or another. Here you have a spider, and here something else. And there's one other image, which I really loved from the Red Book. It really made me, that you addressed, Joe, but it made me go back and look at my Red Book. And this is the image. And of course we see a mandala here, but all the detailed work that is in this image. And then at the bottom is the hieroglyph. And I was just looking at this morning. It's very interesting how it can relate to our time as well, because first we have a flag that looks like a gale warning. It's not yet a hurricane warning, because a hurricane warning would have two flags like this, but it's a gale warning. And then we have something going on with somebody turning people upside down. We don't know what. Then we have some road cones and somebody trying to do something with road cones. And then we have a nice smiley face. It's just an very interesting writing. Would you call that asemic writing too?
You know, it's so hieroglyphic in its style. Yes, I think I would call it asemic writing, but it's so intentional that I think it would be really a subset, don't you, of that larger field.
Well, it's a larger field about which I know nothing, so I'm not the right guy to ask.
I did get completely lost in it at one point. But it's, oh, I see that Jan Clare has put up a link to a book by Michael Jacobson about asemic writing, just called on asemic writing. So that's probably helpful for all of us.
Yeah, thank you, Jan, and that will be in our chat. And so if anybody would like the chat for this video, let me know and I'll be happy to send it to you. And
I would.
Yeah, you'll get it in any case. It's coming to you.
And if somebody has a specific question, just go through my website and there's an automatic email link on there that you're most welcome to be in touch.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Jill.
Thank you all for being a wonderful, wonderful group to enjoy and share this with. It brings out, every group brings out something different in the presenter, and you certainly all have in me. So.
Yeah, I do want to mention we have several other sessions coming up, including possibly one extremely exciting one, but it's too early to mention. But there are some others that are going to be interesting. On Tuesday at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, we're going to have Dr. Ann Lee, who is a training analyst in Zurich, who is going to talk to us about Dr. Jung and Taoism, and also about the secret of the golden flower and how they fit together. That's on August the 18th at 1 p.m. And then on Saturday the 29th, we have Eva Ryder, who's going to talk about Kabbalistic Tarot with us and the Kabbalah. And on Sunday the 30th, we have Becca Tarnas, who has done a comparison between Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien and Jung's Red Book. And she's written an essay called The Imaginal, I forget exactly how she talked about it, but she was talking about the imaginal world and how one writes from that. And so that's going to be a very powerful session also, and that will be 2 weeks from today. So I hope you'll all come, and you can write to me at skip.conover@gmail.com if you want to be included in those sessions. So anything else before we conclude today? Tim, do you want to close us out here?
Sure. Jill, I just can't thank you enough for this. I've so enjoyed your book, and I recommend it to other people to you know, anybody who's really interested in Jung, and particularly in the artworks. It's just been a fascinating journey. And I love that I felt like I could enter into the room with you and, you know, meet his grandsons and sit at his desk and be able to really experience the Red Book in a really intimate way.
That was my intention. I just wanted to share it with you, you know, take you along with me. We can't travel very far at the moment, any of us, but at least we can travel in this way.
Yes.
And to have you beside the lake in Zurich was lovely for me. I just will say at the end that I didn't state the obvious, which is that given 16 years and the number of hours that Jung must have spent with this, I considered those the unknown hours. That's what I was curious about. We knew so much about what he did during the day, what he did in the evening, you know, what talks he gave and everything else. But I thought, what about all the hours we don't know about? And that's what led me to call it what I did, the Red Book Hours, because I felt that those hours deserved our attention, not our intrusion, but our attention.
Oh, that's really beautiful.
Thank you.
And the chat is just full of thanks from all these people. So I'm sure everybody joins me in our sincere thanks for your time today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Blessings,
so much,
everybody.
Jill, for being here. And peace, everyone. We'll be on at 8 p.m. tomorrow night for the second session on the Tarot, for those of you that are interested in it. So peace. See you soon.